In this episode of our series on artificial intelligence, Professor Simon Schaffer and I discuss the surprisingly long history of machines mimicking human activity. It's a very peculiar story indeed, in which world-changing scientific advances sit cheek by jowl with deceit, spin and chicanery.
The history of automata is a very long one, and it's a multicultural one. Many cultures have been interested in the capacity of ingenious machines to mimic certain forms of behaviour. The forms of behaviour, I think, initially that were mimicked the most were forms of behaviour to do with time. From the early modern period, the construction of the great city clocks in Strasbourg, in Prague, in Basel and elsewhere, where you showed something quite like a dance of death, which is always in early modern and pre-modern cultures associated with time. And what is mechanized is the movement of time as the movement of select people. So there, the automaton is a symbol of fate, you could argue. It's a symbol of the way in which what might seem to be free is in fact determined. And then from the early modern period, I would say through the middle of the 19th century, automata expand their scope massively, and in particular in two areas. One is to simply represent the increasing range of skills that machines can execute. Playing musical instruments, drawing, writing, dancing, and on the other hand, the task of subaltern labour, in which you have automata that grind and work at the mill and execute the tasks that the proletariat executes. So this gave early modern automata a kind of two-faced quality, in which on the one hand, very large numbers of the social roles being discharged in the economy perhaps could be mechanized, and on the other hand, there was this kind of knowingly dodgy entertainment of showing increasingly noble, increasingly aristocratic functions being performed by machine. But it's also, I do want to emphasize the fact that automata rapidly become kind of the advance guard, the gateway drug for automation in general. So the famous example of this is the Turkish chess player. So, as is well known, partly because Amazon have expropriated the name, fascinatingly, in the 1760s and 70s, a Slovak engineer, Wolfgang von Kempelen, designs and commissions a machine that seems to be able to play chess.
The Turk, an extraordinary chess-playing contraption, was an international cause célèbre and famously performed in front of Napoleon. But far less well known is the peculiar way in which it inspired one of the most important scientific breakthroughs in the history of automation.
It goes on tour round Western Europe. It goes to Berlin, it goes to Paris, it comes to London. In 1784, its deeds are covered in the local newspapers. One of the readers of those newspapers is a Midlands cleric called Edmund Cartwright, who at dinner one day in Matlock, near Richard Arkwright's cotton mill in Matlock, Cartwright is having dinner with a group of manufacturers from Manchester. And they are discussing the automation that Arkwright has introduced into his mill. And the Manchester men say, yeah, but you couldn't mechanize spinning, could you? You couldn't automate spinning. You can automate weaving, but you can't automate spinning. And Cartwright says, well, if you can build a machine that can play chess, you can certainly build a machine that can automate spinning. And he designed such a machine.
Cartwright invented the power loom, one of the most significant developments in the whole of the Industrial Revolution. But decades later, the machine which inspired him, the Turk, was revealed to have been harbouring a major secret. Hidden inside its body and playing all the moves was a human being, a chess master. The Turk was a hoax, an elaborate fraud perpetrated on a marvelling public. So did he think the Turk was real then?
Well, he must have thought that the Turk was a machine. Otherwise, the argument doesn't work.
So the great irony is that this extraordinary moment happens on a complete fraud, basically.
Indeed. And I think that's what's entertaining here, that you are prepared to suspend your disbelief, even under circumstances where essentially almost everybody who saw the Turk realised that it was a trick, but could not work out what the trick was. They nevertheless use it, as Cartwright does, to motivate reflections on what machines can do.
One of the most beautiful inventions of the 18th century was this clockwork doll, which has 6,000 internal moving parts. His eyes follow what he's writing, and his head moves as he takes up some ink. It was built by the Swiss clockmaker Pierre-Jacques Droz, and it's just as enthralling now as when it was first exhibited. Where does that come from? Why is it so intriguing to us to see a machine replicate something that we do? And I think this is really relevant. I think people just use ChatGPT a lot of the time just to see it do its thing. They don't really...
I think that's absolutely right. I think that's absolutely right.
So that seems very similar to when people saw the Turk or saw the writer or saw any of those machines from back then. And is it just natural curiosity? Is it a sense that we're beginning to understand ourselves a bit better? Is that...
Two things are going on. I mean, one is captured by the phrase the uncanny valley, which is a fancy way of saying if the device that I'm admiring almost but not quite resembles me, then there's something very compelling about it. Right? The original formulation of that is in Freud, in his magnificent essay on the Sandman, on Hoffman's great story about a young man falling in love with an automaton called Olympia. And there's an ambiguity about whether he knows that it's an automaton or not. And Hoffman in the story draws massive attention to the eye of the young man, to the eyes of the young man. It's how you look that produces the uncanny. In German, the unhomely, unheimlich, effects of our relation with an automaton that is and is not human. So that is certainly going on, that one recognizes this simultaneously as self and other. And that has a history, right? And then the complementary theme there, I think, about the compulsion is this notion of suspended disbelief. That you know perfectly well that you are not dealing with another human, and all your social capacities have been designed to deal with other human beings. I think the response is, on the one hand, knowing deceit. I know this is not a human, and I'm willing to suspend my disbelief to imagine that it is. Right? And that seems to me to be key to the whole notion of machine intelligence. That within artificial intelligence and automation, there is, and in a way there has to be, concealment. There has to be deceit. What is going on, and then what massively goes on from the 1810s onwards with the automation of industrial production, which is never complete and always patchy, and human labour never disappears. On the contrary, it gets more and more indispensable. What is going on there is this extraordinary exchange of properties. On the one hand, humans find themselves at work in increasingly mechanized positions. So humans become machines. It's what has been called reification. And on the other hand, machines get treated more and more as though they are living beings. And that's called fetishism. So the properties are exchanged. The relations of labour become the relations of mechanics, basically, and the relations with machinery become essentially the relations with living beings. So I think the reason for, or one reason for that fascination is this intensification of the swapping of the judgments, they are alive and I am a machine. To such an extent that, given that at least in vast areas of Britain now, what you do at a supermarket checkout, what you are doing is mimicking, as far as possible, accurately, the behaviour of an assemblage of machines. Unrecognised object in the bagging area is kind of the most significant slogan about what has happened. You thought you were getting some flour in order to make your apple crumble that evening. What you're actually doing is replicating, as far as you possibly can, the precision of a barcode, a laser scanner, a weighing machine, and so on. So, and insofar as you can execute the action of a set of machines, you successfully pass this test.
It is a test, actually.
It's an exam.
I've never thought of my apple crumble being so reliant on high technology machinery, but you're right. I did make some apple crumble the other day, and I bought some flour, and I had to go through this whole process. So my apple crumble involved high precision scales, laser beams, very complicated printing machinery.
Absolutely.
Just to make an apple crumble.
Absolutely. In order, as we would say in the trade, to valorize that commodity. So the activity of acquisition, assuming you can afford it, given what's laughingly known as the cost of living crisis, but is actually, a much wider and more intense economic crisis, is simply to make one rehearse that action, right? And not to trivialize what is an immensely serious topic for vast numbers of people, what is going on there is drawing our attention to the way in which more and more often living in the social economy requires executing an action which is mechanical, which mimics under some tolerance, but the tolerance is not very wide, annoyingly, right? Very annoyingly in some cases, the action of a programmed machine. So it's not so much, or rather it's not only that in the current conjuncture machines are taking over more and more of what humans can do. It's also the case, one's tempted to say it's rather the case, that humans are being required to do more and more of the things that machines do.
In the next episode, we'll see how this process, in which human activity was being increasingly replicated by machines, was to lead to the creation of this extraordinary piece of mechanization, widely recognized as the world's first computer. If you want to know when the next episode in this series is available, please click the button below to subscribe. Thank you.